This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. It's always fun to talk with Scott Kiloby. I really admire his persistence, his authenticity, his honesty. He inquires into everything in his life, and he brings to life what we can work with as well. He has a practical frame for how we can become free. He's been working with his own chronic pain from spinal stenosis for the last 3 or 4 years. And he has found a way to inquire so deeply into it that that pain is largely gone now. This interview is on emotional repression and how that practice of inquiry, that deep inquiry, helped to free himself from the chronic pain in his back. I hope you enjoy our conversation. This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. I'm so happy to be here again with Scott Kiloby. The Kiloby Center presents the Radical Recovery Summit, and I'm always interested to hear what you're doing. One of the things that's really the same about you all the time is that you're always different. You're always going more and more deeply into healing and inquiry. And this year we're focusing on emotional repression, which is a new kind of theme in what you're doing. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how that came about? Last year we worked on the chronic pain that you'd been working with, and has this kind of grown out of that?
Yeah, and I don't know exactly what I said about the chronic pain last year, but for me, the reason the work changes is because using the work to actually apply to our life, like what shows up in our life. So for me, the chronic pain showed up. I mean, this was after all the big spiritual experiences and shifts. So, I thought it was a physical thing. And partly it was because there was an abnormality in the mid spine. You could see a bulge disc on the scans. You could see a bone spur protruding into the spinal cord, and you could see a narrowing of the spinal cord, which pinched it. So all my doctors were saying that's the source of the pain. So I started to do their medical treatments and their medications. And although some people get relief from medical procedures with things like this, many don't. And so I kept running up against that wall. Like, I'm getting temporary relief. This is covering up the symptoms. What's this really about? So I became interested in John Sarno's work, Dr. John Sarno, who was apparently very successful treating these a myriad of different chronic pain situations by getting to the root of it being emotional, psychological, rather than physical. So after some resistance to that, because all of the doctors are telling you this is why you're having pain. You see this on the thing. Then taking the work that we've already developed, the Kiloby inquiries, and starting to apply it to that subject, emotional repression, playing around with that. Here I am in enormous pain. So that's not like play. It's a play, but it's serious, like very painful. So anything that would work, I was open to. One thing I noticed right off the bat is when I started to develop the questions that would bring up. So essentially, the way that we do this now is that we've made contact, so to speak, or we're learning how to make conscious the story in the mind that says you cannot and will not feel and or express something like anger. So all my life, although I got angry every now and then for sure, I noticed that it's really conspicuously absent. And I thought, well, there's something to this, but I didn't know where that mechanism was. And I think a lot of people are like that. They know, or they may have some sense, but where is that? Like, what do you do with that?
Mhm.
So in some way, I think I just made contact. Was able to bring up the story that says, no, you can't. And when I brought it up, I noticed a direct connection between that and the pain. So every time I would say the inquiry, the pain would flare up and the story would say, no, you can't feel and express anger. What I did is just stayed with it. I just kept bringing it back up. And every time I would do that each day, I would get some pain relief each day. Just so it was a great pain relief tool. But over time, the trajectory I noticed is that the signal itself was diminishing over time. And so I stopped doing everything else so that I could see if this is what it was. Before I was journaling everything like, okay, so I do this kind of physical movement, Belgian Christ, this, that, yoga, exercising, back extension. And I was writing down how that was affecting it. Well, I just stopped doing almost all of that. because I became interested in, if is there an emotional root here? So I stayed in that inquiry. So I was able to discern then that the inquiry itself was, I could actually see it while I was inquiring. I could see the stories getting lighter, and I could feel the thing shifting literally in real time. And then I saw over as standing back a trajectory of what was happening. And so then I stayed with that inquiry, and I kept getting the response, no, you can't feel, you can't express it, until one day it was like, yes, you can. And it's like, that's new. And shortly after that, two things happened. One, the pain substantially went away. That,
Mhm,
along with other inquiries, the pain was then gone, and anger for a while came up.
mhm,
So that was a whole process of, that whole thing just woke me up to this, like wow, we may have access to something here that we didn't have before. So I started doing it with other people. They are experiencing the same thing. There's a story in the mind about repression. They have it, no matter how, you know, skillful their spiritual practice was or meditation, this thing eludes us. So learning the same skills, I mean, doing the same skills I was doing myself, showing them that, then they could finally access it, and they're seeing some of the same insights. Many of my clients are, their pain is just going down. They're in that trajectory right now. Some have already lost their pain. There are some who have some resistance to it. We have to work a little harder on it. Um, but before I say that it was all repression, I also noticed some other things connected to the pain. So in the inquiry, it wasn't just anger repression. There were some other repressions there, and some old traumas that, although I had seen in my experience before, they seemed to be connected to this pain in a way that I had not had access to them, certain programs. And so somehow the pain gave me access to still unresolved trauma, and that contributed to apparently the pain going away. So nobody, with having the conditions that I have, essentially, if you have these conditions, especially spinal stenosis, the prognosis is it's never going to get better, and you're going
mhm,
to be in pain for the rest of your life. Well, that's not my experience anymore. So it's interesting to be now talking about it and working with other people who may have some of the same thoughts or being diagnosed in the same way, with the same conditions or similar conditions, and having the mindset that this is a life sentence. There's nothing you can do about it. You can medicate it, you can manage it, but deal with it. So, a big part of my message now is, let's explore this, because if this has just not been something that's been accessible to us before, that's one thing, not having access to it. But now we have access to it. Let's see what happens. Like, is there a healing that can happen? So I'm totally energized and inspired around this in a big way, because it's helped me so much. And so I'm enjoying these days of getting out and talking about it like this with people.
mhm. That's a powerful set of statements that you've just made, that
Yeah.
your pain is largely gone away. And one of the things, right, that just kind of comes up right away is when I say to people, my trauma has largely healed. I
Yeah.
don't feel traumatized the way I used to. I'm not triggered all the time the way I used to. Or if I am, it's much less and it resolves more quickly. So that's kind
Yeah.
of what you're saying here too. And and lots of times people say, well, I'd like to believe that could happen for me, but yeah, probably not. So how do you work with someone who really has that firm belief that it's not going to happen for me?
You always ask the right questions, because that's something I had to deal with first, is that I had a belief system that it was physical. So there are all
Mhm,
sorts of front end beliefs that people are dealing with, like that it's physical and not emotional, or that they're always going to be in pain no matter what, like self sabotaging beliefs on the front end, or, yeah, Scott can do it, but I'm not good enough, or I can't do it. So a lot of times I'm working with people on those belief systems first, so that they can just become open first before they may experience any healing. But it's a huge part of this work. This repression work is the front end obstacles that show up. Sometimes people just feel ashamed. I'm talking about it, and they're interpreting it as, "Oh, you're saying that I did this." And it's really not like that, because repression is unconscious and involuntary. You didn't decide to do it consciously, but you know how the ego will take things personally. So that can be a showstopper, just feeling shamed, or fear. because, you know, when we go into these things, we're going into old survival patterns that have served us well. So
Mhm.
repressing anger may have served us well in a number of ways, but and now someone's saying, okay, let's go look at that and lift that up. That can be scary because even if you're not aware of where the fear is coming from, it's resistance to this whole notion of letting go of a big part of my personality structure, the one that is trying to walk around and being good and nice and spiritual and never angry. So that can be threatening to people. So a big part of the work is just working with these front end beliefs and emotions that may stop people from going deeper.
So, what do we get out of believing that we need to be nice? What are some of the things that you've discovered and that
Yeah,
other people have been bringing forward?
it's so for me, and I see it with other people, this is, I protect myself this way by being nice and spiritual because if I don't get angry, then I don't have to deal with that conflict. And so I'm safe. Um, get love this way because if you're a very peaceful person or you show up that way, that's attractive to a lot of people, you know, because you're a good listener. You don't really, you're not rocking the boat. You're not likely one that's going to bring in conflict. So you'd be welcome to the gathering, you know, whereas your uncle, who's the loudmouth about politics, and not going to invite him, you're welcome and people like you and they may say you're a good listener and you're so peaceful and so good. And then that reinforces it all along the way. So that's mainly it: safety, getting love, attention, approval, protecting oneself. Those are the big ones that I see.
So, because those are unconscious beliefs, and so then the neuroception of that is it's not safe for me to do, it's not safe for me to be angry. So,
That's
can you talk
exactly
about
right.
how the ego and the personal part of that comes in?
That's a great question. Let me talk about my own experiences. I don't think I had any insight as to how it developed from the events of my childhood until I really went into inquiry to see it.
Mhm.
Because the pattern of my personality was peaceful, you know, the peacemaker. But when I went back to see some of the chaos going on in my own home, like where people were fighting, mom and dad were going through things, I can see that certain events, including being bullied, you know, played a big part of that. The event, but then I survived all that. That's the thing. I survived the chaos in my family and I survived the bullying. And the way that I survived that was by repressing fear and anger and just showing up this way. The events then become the personality structure. And I don't think we know exactly how that happens, like from a scientific view yet, but from an interior awareness, we can see the connections. So, in other words, literally taking someone back into inquiry, when you pull an event up from childhood, you can see the programs that attend the event. The programs are the thoughts that say, I'm not safe. It's not safe to get angry. I can't show him my fear. I have to run and hide. And so if you look at those programs, those are often the programs that we're then carrying with us through life. They're like programs that inform all relationships and situations. So it becomes our personality structure. But you can pretty much harken back to where it kind of began. It may have even started before that. I've had some past life stuff coming up. But in this life, you can kind of go back to certain events and find the programs. And then those are the same thing that attend the personality itself. It's not just the
Mhm.
event, but the personality then, the ego.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And so then we add on a dollop of shame.
Yeah,
So it's like I have to hide and I'm ashamed that I have to hide or
right.
so how do you see that? Or do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, that's another layer of it for sure. Because in doing but the good thing about the repression inquiry is it'll tend to bring up the shame because
Mm,
it kind of brings up everything that's in there that keeps it from happening. And one thing that's very convenient is the feeling of shame around anger because it helps keep it down. So subtly shaming oneself into not expressing it, or when you express it, then feeling shame because you expressed it is like it's a conditioning that continues to keep you from expressing it. So we have inquiries, as you know, that directly target the shame, like to bring it up, to let it be seen and dissolve. But it really comes up a lot with the anger repression work because it's so closely connected to it. And by the way, shame attends the events and trauma too sometimes. So you got a dominant father or bully, the science says that often shame gets connected to the trauma, and repression does. So there's the shame of the event of being bullied or dad's angry. And then again, something that we learn. So that carries with us or attends the trauma and then becomes built into our personality structure. The shame then helps us to continue to show up as the ego rather than the more authentic way, which is just to be with what's really here and be open to it.
That's a big ask, isn't it? To just
It's
be with what's
huge.
there.
It's a huge ask. Yeah,
So you describing these circumstances, conditioning, informing beliefs, and these patterns and real experiences of I'm welcome, I'm not welcome. I can't afford to feel angry. Or so what was that moment like for you? And it's like, oh, I can. I'm getting a yes there.
liberating, very, very freeing, empowering. Because all the time of my life when I couldn't express anger, there was at least some shutdown or a feeling of disempowerment or submission or even deficiency that goes with it. So continuously being shut down in relationship, there's no empowerment. So being able to express anger is for me not ultimately about putting anger on people. We can talk about that in a second. It's about the feeling of empowerment when you're no longer living from the repression. So that's really liberating. If you look up one definition on the internet of what's the opposite of repression, you would think expression, but they say no, freedom. And so that's how I feel into that. There's a freedom there that I could never experience just with non-dual pointers, for example. That's freeing all the work that we've done. But this is a whole nother facet of this that goes into something like embodiment, something like that, words that we can point to. I mean, it's been awesome. I can't tell you how awesome it's been to feel like that's online now. I feel even more aliveness and more like it just feels more authentic. Those are the words I can put on it. But I couldn't know it until I saw the repression that I couldn't. That's why I didn't talk about it for years because I didn't know. I had no
Mm,
idea.
right. So
Yeah.
then what's your sense? I know there's probably not a really scientific answer for this, but what's your sense of how that translated into back pain and then how seeing that translated into the relief of that?
The science behind it, I think I don't have a lot. I mean, I've read Sarno. Well, there's some studies saying first that the emotional system mirrors the immune system, which makes sense as if you're repressing something, then if some disease arises because of that, I mean, you can see the connection there. But with chronic pain, I don't know. I mean, Sarno talks about inflammation, or I've heard talk. There's a study out about inflammation, how the emotions affect inflammation very directly. So, with inflammation, for example, again, it gets treated from the outside, right? Take a pill
Mhm.
or whatever else. But what if the emotional repression is contributing to the inflammation? And what if that's what's happening? But not being a doctor, I don't know. All I know is the interior experience. So I'm interested, and I've been getting on YouTube to say, hey, where are the doctors out there? Because I'd like to know from your viewpoint, what do we actually know about this? So I'm learning to supplement that information now. But frankly, I don't think a lot of the doctors know it exactly. Even the science is saying, yes, there's some link, but they're not exactly sure yet. They're discovering that. And so when they do, I'm going to be very interested to see what they find out. But in interior awareness, as you know, you don't experience inflammation or cells or
Mhm.
bones or muscles. Those are there, but you could, like from the outside, a doctor could say, oh, here's your bones, here's your muscle, but from interior awareness, it's words, pictures, feelings, and sensations. So that's what I'm familiar with is the interior experience of that. But I want to know just as much as you do beyond what I already know and what's happening with that. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. And I don't play one on YouTube either. I'm just not.
No, you're very honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it makes sense, like if you look at there's a common kind of a gut knowing that if you suppress any emotion, you suppress everything. So if you suppress anger, you're going to suppress joy. If you
Mhm.
suppress grief, you're going to suppress happiness. Those kind of go together. So it kind of makes sense then that if we're
Yeah.
suppressing anything, that there's a real contraction in the body somehow.
Yeah. And you and I are in the kind of the non-dual meditation spirituality world. And I think part of it shows up as a
Mhm.
flatness in experience that people, or yeah, certainly the stuck in awareness that you hear people talk about in non-dual, but also a flatness where people will say, yeah, I feel presence is very peaceful. It's very liberating. And yet there's still something flat about it. Like, and if you think about it, it's like an antidepressant makes things flat because it's sort of like keeping all that. So this is similar. Repression does that, I think, of flatness in your experience. So yeah, because one of the things we can talk about are what are the signs of repression. So because it's not going to show up, it's repressed. It's not like
Mhm.
you're going to have a thought and say, "Oh, I know exactly what it is," and by knowing it, now it's gone. It's, you know how it is. You have to really discover it. But there are signs. For me, it was chronic pain. Couldn't avoid that sign. But for others, it might be more subtle. Like, we can talk about that at a certain point. I don't think I answered your question, but that's okay.
No, no, that's good. So let's talk about that though. What are some of the things that if that flatness, it could also, if you're looking at it in terms of the nervous system, you could be in a state of like a dorsal vagal state of freeze.
Freeze.
I've been in
Yep.
that state most of my life, and I would have said, "Oh, I was so calm." People said she was so calm,
Yeah.
right? So as we come out of that, we become more alive. That's for sure.
Yes.
So that's
That's a
one
good way
big
of saying
signal. Yeah.
it. Yeah.
So what else are you seeing?
Dissociation,
Mhm.
frozenness and dissociation. Some may say it's the same, but some people feel it a little bit different. That's a similar thing, a sign of there's something that may be not accessible, that you had to protect yourself by not making accessible. So chronic pain, and according to science, illness itself, we ought to be looking at, which is not to say that all chronic pain situations or all illnesses are emotionally based. We don't want to put all the eggs in one basket, but the studies are being done. So one of the signs is, do you have chronic pain? And have you not been able to find much relief for it? Because that could point to it, or some illness that could be a contributing factor, those signs. But other than that, it would be flatness. It would be, I mean, it's really subtle. It's like it's in your language. It's how you talk. So, or it's how you respond to others. So, as a peacemaker, what I spent a lot of time doing is whenever I would see people get angry or conflict, I was always trying to like remedy that, like trying to get people to not be angry. And so that's a sign that you repress it within yourself if you're really fixated on that. Like when anger comes up in someone else, instead of acknowledging why the person is angry and what they're responding to, you're more focused on the fact that they are angry. And that's upsetting or something like that. Avoidance of conflict might be, not to say that we should be going into getting conflict everywhere, but an avoidance of it might point to it. Um, Being on a spiritual path and getting to a place where you just can't go any further. So people are like in the non-dual teachings, they're doing the awareness practices, but something in their body remains very persistent. And it's like no matter how much time or how deep they're resting as awareness, this thing persists. That's a sign, I think. Um, so there's actually lots of signs if you think about it, but somehow we've, I think, blinded ourselves to them, or we're at least in spirituality, we don't talk about it a lot, but now we can, I guess.
Mhm. So let's tie addiction into this.
Mm. That's all you have to say. Is there anything you wanted to ask about that?
No,
Or you
just
just
go ahead.
that is like right on the cusp because again,
Right.
the science is there. And if you read the old studies, they won't make a direct link as much from emotional repression to addiction, but the newer studies are. And that to me just makes common sense because if I'm already repressing or suppressing something, drinking helps that. I don't have to feel it. I can numb out. So yeah, I think there's a direct relation. And we've been hearing a lot in the last few years how trauma is driving it, but I think this is like the cousin of that. This is a thing that we're not fully opened up to in a lot of our modalities. And I think that's also the reason why people are doing a lot of trauma work, but not necessarily getting deep enough in the somatic. It feels like, yeah, but how many times have you heard people say, "I've done 20 years of trauma work"? It's like,
A
well,
lot.
maybe you're missing the cousin. Either maybe you don't have a modality that's skillful enough to deconstruct it, but also maybe there's a piece of it that you're missing here, the repression. So And let's talk about spiritual seeking because to me, it can be addictive. It was for me. And I can see how emotional repression was driving that. It's all interconnected. So even seeking can be a sign that something is going on in your body that you're trying to escape. It's almost like the signs are everywhere, but addiction is certainly a sign of it. Doesn't mean there is repression just because you're addicted, but if I were addicted right now and I heard this message, I'd be checking into that. Like, because science is saying it, why
Hmm.
not check into it? Yeah, so there's not much more to say about it. I think it's pretty common sense for addiction. I think where it gets harder for people to see maybe is around other mental health issues, maybe. Like someone with borderline personality disorder or bipolar might not think, maybe, might not make the connection as much to repression, but it's science is telling us it's there too, to look there. So yeah, it's a big topic and it seems to be affecting us in a lot of different ways.
Hmm. Well, and it does make sense that addiction is an attempt to get away from something. And
Yeah,
if we're not repressing something, what is it we're trying to get away from? So sometimes it's
right,
just our circumstances are very difficult and we
right,
want to take a break from them.
right.
But when we're talking about addiction, that's kind of another level of intensity or
Yeah, the compulsivity is how I say it. Because I could eat a brownie or drink a beer, and that's one thing. But the compulsive, that's where we want to look to the deeper drivers. And I think that that is now a driver that we now know that emotional repression is a driver along with trauma and these other things. So we've added that into our way, with the KI, the Kiloby inquiries, we've added that in emotional repression on the addiction piece.
what would it look like if someone was doing an inquiry session with you around emotional repression? So maybe you've already cleared a few of the front end issues around I can't afford to feel it, but just whatever you might want to bring forward around that.
Well, the first thing I do is these days is I get a full inventory to understand the dynamics of the family that they came from. Like I want to know what in the person's view, how father showed up, how did mom show up, and how did you show up in relationship. So that tells us a lot about what was allowed and what wasn't allowed in the household. Yeah, we have to work with the front end beliefs, as you mentioned, sometimes first. And often we're focusing on an area of the body. The people that come to me on this, a lot of them are experiencing chronic pain or contraction. So a lot of the focus is on that area of the body. And then using inquiries that evoke the story that says, either I can't feel it, or I don't want to feel it, or it's not safe to feel it, and or I don't want to express it, I can't express it, or it's not safe to express it. So all the inquiries hover around those programs, but everybody's different, and in the sense that the resistance to that is different for everyone. What I'm noticing is that for people in a lot of pain or who have been diagnosed with a serious illness, sometimes there is more openness to it because the physical has come, it's become physiological for them. But if you're not, it's like anything, if you're not experiencing a lot of pain around something, there may be more resistance because it's like, I'm not doing this to relieve pain. I'm doing this as part of my path. But my ego has been working well for me. So I don't know if I want to go. So there's resistance to going into it um, until and unless something bigger happens in our life, which is for me the gift, the true gift. Even though I never would have said it during it was the chronic pain. It was a gift for me. It was almost like, if I can just speak loosely, it's like the universe saying, you can avoid this anger all your life, but it's not going to avoid you. And now it's going to be physical pain. Are you still going to avoid it? Or
Right.
what do I have to do to get your attention, essentially? So, in some ways, even though we're fraught with a lot of suffering and different things that happen in our life, in some way, they're pointing us back to freedom, to clarity, like even like addiction. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say on here that it was the rock bottom moment, which was the important thing that happened? So these things, even though they're very painful, it's such a cliche, but they're all opportunities to go deeper. Unless, of course, it's a physical thing. I don't want to send the message out there that everything you're experiencing is emotional. Yeah, I'm
Mhm.
not saying that, but it could be that what you're experiencing is connected to that.
When I was about 40, I needed to have my uterus removed. I needed to have a hysterectomy. I had really big fibroids, and I was also meditating and learning about the mind as a field of energy, warps in the energy field translate into the body. And I was very ashamed that I couldn't fix the fibroids in my uterus with
Hmm.
meditation. And so finally I had, I kind of came to the point where, okay, it's ridiculous. I need to do this. It's really affecting my health and everything else. But I was really embarrassed to tell my meditation teacher that I was going in the hospital for this surgery and I wouldn't be at meditation for a while.
Hmm.
And I just, when I look at it, I can trace back the sexual trauma around puberty, my early teens. I can see all of the things that most likely led to that condition. And it's not reasonable to think that I could do that through meditation. These are
Right.
patterns that have happened in that case for 25, 30 years.
Totally.
And so it was just very clear to me that there was something wrong with that philosophy that I had imbibed that said there's something wrong with me that I can't fix this through meditating.
Hmm. Right.
And it's interesting to see.
It's something that's another thing that people have to deal with along the way is the shame or that's what I'm saying is the shame. But here's the other thing. It didn't heal for me in meditation either. Like part of the story is that I spent 2 years in pain, not very skillful with the inquiry, and then just resting in a meditative awareness, because that's my experience. Meditative awareness is always here. So nothing happened. The pain got worse. So yeah, it wasn't until I started to again use inquiries that provoke specific material that wasn't coming up already in meditative awareness. That's the big takeaway here, is that I could sit in awareness or in meditation and the whole story of repressing doesn't even come up, or if it comes up it just like and gone. So for me, just meditating with that wouldn't have done it. It was the repetitiously pulling up program to see it because it likes to hide. That's where the relief came. But let me speak to your question. The way that what I say to people is don't stop going to your doctor. Please don't stop going, because your doctor and this work can work in tandem to discern what is really going on there. You need that doctor to help you because there could be something going on physical that inquiry will not reach. But if you're doing both, you're covering everything at least, so that if it isn't physical, here, this somatic work can help. And so if you take that approach then and work through the shame, you may find your solution in the medical field. That's fine, but at least you didn't skip over here. This part, you didn't skip over it, is the idea. And so everybody has to find their own way in that because every condition is different and
Mhm.
everyone's conscious is different. The level of resistance is different. The level of skill is different for everyone. So all these factors play into it, I think.
And then we bring in our own understanding as well, uh, of everything. Like for me, I don't think that the meditation tradition was telling me that I should be able to fix
Ah,
it, but I had
I see.
somehow taken that on as a belief,
I got it.
you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Right.
So I want to come back to something you said a minute ago about feeling it and expressing it. So there's two levels there. One is permission to feel it, another is permission to express it to ourselves, express it to somebody else, change relationships, change how we are in the world. So how do you work with those two levels? Are they sequential? Do they work together?
Really good question. So coming from the conditioning here that said I couldn't feel and express it, I had to be careful about the expressing part because automatically the condition would say don't express it. So I can't listen to that teacher, the one back here that has already
Mm.
decided that it's unsafe. So I needed to go fully into I can express it because otherwise it'd be the conditioning stopping me on that, the bias. So then being able to express it, and I happen to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't repress anger, just not a repression. So for a while, it came up and I put it on him a few times until I recognized now that anger or rage is actually here, it doesn't work. It doesn't actually work to resolve the issue. It may be good for my health or something, but so then I'm working with people on what I say to people is we're not saying express it or not express it. It's like drinking. It's like when you do inquiry on when we do inquiry on drinking, we might have an inquiry that says it's okay to drink beer. To pull up part of the mind that says no to that, because that part of the mind can make preoccupation stronger. The
Mhm.
voice that says I have to quit eating cupcakes can actually reinforce the compulsion. So we're bringing that up to help with that piece of it, but we're not saying then go drink beer. We're not saying anything about that. And this is the same here is we're seeing the expression of anger is first of all accessible to you. Is there a block? We're not saying now go puke anger on your dad, but that can happen. But that's an opportunity too, because as I finally was able to fully feel and express anger, what that allowed me to do is to unpack the more vulnerable emotions that are packed into it. So I'm developing inquiry now where once anger is accessible for people, we're doing inquiry to make that more conscious because the anger comes up with its own programs and stories, like people should be different. You shouldn't be doing that. Why are you doing that? Damn it, all that stuff. So making that conscious at the anger level so that we can feel it, allow it to dissolve, not tuck it back in, but then moving down to other layers, like bringing up the fear that's right under the anger, like provoking the thoughts and the feelings of that up. So that's a more vulnerable emotion. And then the shame that might be underlying that and the hurt. And so at the end of that set of inquiries, there's a vulnerability that happens where there's where things can be resolved in the vulnerability flow. And, if you can be vulnerable, there's more communication, there's less, but you can't do that necessarily when you're really angry. There's not a lot of vulnerability. And sometimes if you're getting angry, people will think, well, then I find that that's what I need. I just need to be angry at people. Well, but you'll find that's not really the final landing place because with the anger, there's more to see, the vulnerability. And sometimes people can't really see the more vulnerable emotions until they have anger accessible. Like they have to have it accessible to really see that down deep they're hurt. Some people will try to go into the hurt as a way to keep the anger from coming, but that's
Mhm.
repression. So what we're saying is have it accessible, but then inquire into it, unpack it, see that at the very base of it, you're feeling vulnerable or you don't want to be vulnerable. But when you get to the vulnerability, something new can happen in relationship where it couldn't before, either because anger was repressed or because it was being expressed and there's no vulnerability. So it's like a doorway into something else here. And just want to say something else is that what I'm finding with the people that I work with who go deep, they don't end up just puking anger on people, or they may for a while, because there's insights to be had in that. And then what happens is they'll say, now my voice is online even more. So I can say, I can set boundaries, I can tell you what my wants and needs are more freely. And when you're able to express along the way in life, you don't build up the anger as much. It's that simple. So just being able to express, that's the thing that people are finding more than, oh, they'll find the landing places now I can just be angry at everybody. There's more there.
Mhm. And we can see in the world right now people who are in a fight response around so many things, politics,
Mhm.
COVID, masks, vaccines, all of that. Being in a
Yes.
fight response. So what's the difference between being in a fight response and feeling and expressing anger?
Being in a fight response and feeling, well, in some ways they're not different, right? Because if we're just in a trauma response and so there's different trauma responses, fight, freeze, fawn. Those are all trauma responses and anger can be your thing. So your thing might be fighting. That might be your natural trauma response. But to unpack that, to see what's under that is where the real depth of transformation happens. It's not just continuing to respond in the same way, but to inquire into that response to see again, there might be something more vulnerable there. Um, but there's certainly anger that they say is clean, okay, that isn't coming so much from ego or whatever. That's different. But a lot of our responses to like politics and the vaccine, I think, are coming from old trauma and these programs more than it's. I don't see a lot of clean stuff. Every now and then, there's something really clean. Most of the people are just and they're re-experiencing their traumas on the world stage, like with the masks, the vaccine, not seeing that it isn't about what you think it is. It might look like it's about the masks, but coming back, it goes right back to mom and dad and trauma or repression. But that's the real takeaway for me in terms of the world stage is like, how can we use the world stage to show us what's really going on within our own consciousness? I don't know if that's your question, but that's how I see it is
Hmm.
everything's an opportunity. Like if you hate Donald Trump, it's an opportunity. If you hate Biden, if you hate masks, it's all an opportunity to see what's under that.
Well, and then there's the feeling of powerlessness, which I think is being triggered so much right now. And it really, so do you want to comment on how powerlessness and wanting to avoid feeling that? Obviously, that has roots in our childhood as well. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working with some people who, for example, feel that powerlessness over what's going on the world stage. So, like the vaccines coming in to Australia, some of the people down there are feeling a real outrage against some of the stuff going on. But as you take them into inquiry, one of the first things they do is they recognize they do feel powerless. Which is okay. But then does that harken back to something from your past, like mom or dad? And so if you can go and kind of resolve it on that level with mom and dad, then when you come back to the world stage thing, it's going to feel different. You may still have the same viewpoint. Like, I don't think masks are a good idea, but the energy is resolved around it because you saw that it was largely personal and not worldly or political. And I think that's important to see. And if we don't see that, like, how many more years or decades are we going to keep doing this? Like, not seeing that this is all there to wake us up back to our past. There's a richness in everything that's going on in the world for us to see
Well,
how.
50 years ago, one of the slogans was the personal is political.
Yes, I had that
Right?
coming up when I said that. Yes,
Yeah.
who said that? Brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much
Well, and
so.
that was specifically around the feminist movement, around our bodies. The personal is political, but it certainly applies to this situation with COVID and feeling powerless and going into a fight response, all of that too. Yeah.
Yes.
So people are starting to feel like I'm starting to buy into this. I can see what Scott's saying. I can feel I've got some repressed anger. What's a few steps that they could take?
If you're going to work with it with our modality, one of the steps is just to learn some of the basic tools and reverse inquiry, utility inquiry, mining at least. Um, so whether you work on that on your own or with someone is a question. Like I was able to work with it on my own, but I don't know that everybody can. Some will. So getting support from someone who can take you through it, like a facilitator who's traversed that territory, who can ask the right questions and watch for re-traumatization, because that can happen with this for
Mhm.
sure. Because it's an old emotion coming up. Someone who has the skill to deal with that, that might be the smartest step, is to work with someone who's been through that, who has the skills. But many people are just starting it on their own because they can't afford sessions, and so that's a tricky thing. But what I'm trying to do is just be more accessible to people. I'm starting a forum actually that I want to talk about. There's going to be a forum that we create where the facilitators that are on my site have direct access to the people doing this work. So on a daily basis, we're supporting them and helping them, even if they can't do sessions. So we're trying to bridge that gap between being all alone looking at something and doing sessions where you're fully supported. There's a big divide there. So with this
Mhm.
new forum, trying to bridge that gap a little bit more, because we know that people are going to become interested in it. You can't help it if you resonate with it. But then how you do it is important, because you have to understand that there's going to be probably a lot of resistance first. And if you don't know how to work with the resistance, what would you do then if you open up the can of worms and there's nothing but resistance there? You just kind of live in that for a while. Re traumatization can happen. All sorts of things can happen. So if you're with someone who can guide you through it, who've seen it happen with themselves or others, then that can be helpful.
Just want to share a little story about someone who's working with Dan McClintock, and she was saying that she had a situation where she was able to express her anger about something. She was able to tell this other person, "No, we're not going to continue as friends. You express contempt for me. You manipulate me. No, I'm done." And the other person's like, "Oh, you're being too angry." And she's like, "I'm fine with being angry. It's
Uh-huh.
appropriate at the moment."
Right.
But so what happened next, though, is that her nervous system was in a big uproar, of course. It was hard for her. She does a lot of, normally she would have gone into some kind of compliance. So she had a big uproar, but then she was able to calm it down within a day or two. And she said the difference was that she wasn't turning against herself in her mind.
Yep.
So she wasn't going, "Why did you let her get away with that? Why didn't you say that thing?" She wasn't doing that. And so that was what enabled her to just kind of come back to regulation, and
Yeah.
what a huge difference that was in her experience.
Yeah. Setting a boundary is not abusive. That's the thing we have to remember. It's not
Mhm.
abusive. So no matter when you're setting a boundary, when someone tries to bring something back to you that you're being abusive, just stay steady. Because for all
Mhm.
of your life, you probably weren't empowered to set this boundary. And once you do it, then stand in that. Because if you're doing inquiry, you'll see just like she sees that you're not going to be beating yourself up so much. So all the time you couldn't set the boundaries because you were listening to that self shaming, self thing.
Mhm.
And look what damage that creates because then you're in all these relationships where you are being abused. So when you set a boundary, that is not abuse. That's
Right.
not the same thing. But in our minds, we often think that any kind of aggression or speaking out is somehow abusive. And we've got to undo that because we have to protect ourselves in certain situations. And
Mhm.
that's okay. Yeah.
Mhm. And so to protect ourselves instead of being codependent or trying to protect someone else. But also, when I look at this too, I can really see the deadening effect it has on relationships when we can't
Mm,
really be present and
mm.
honest. And so if we're going along to get along, that relationship doesn't have a lot of depth or authenticity.
It doesn't.
It's
Well
really
said.
sad. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you have to live that to really know it. You can hear us talking about it, but anybody's listening, just look back at your relationships, and there's another sign right there. There's a good
Mm,
sign.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all kinds of well, for me with my past relationship, there was a lot of excuses why, it wasn't worth it to challenge her. She
Hmm.
was always gonna win because she was always determined she was gonna win. And, I'm the peacemaker, I can get along with, and so to really see, it just that's one of the things as I ended that relationship, I really saw the cost of not being honest and authentic, even
No,
though
and
I
that
couldn't have done it at that time,
right.
but
There's a
yeah,
cost.
what a high cost to it.
It
Mm.
reminds me too that the repression is clever in that it'll say things like, "Well, I could express anger, but they won't listen. It won't matter."
Um,
And then that becomes a conditioned block, keeping it down. So inquire into that. And you may still not express the anger, but to have it accessible, have the expression accessible is what I'm saying. And those little thoughts that seem very wise that say, don't bother, is they keep us locked down around it.
mhm,
So I've noticed that a lot in inquiry, where just those little phrases like, it's not just that she would attack me if I'm angry. It's like she won't listen, she'll walk away, he'll walk away. And those are the kinds of things that we continue to believe, and then we don't bother. And so
right,
we stay that way.
yeah, and a lot of those are probably based on experiences in childhood.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
that's the
circling
tricky
back to
part.
that.
Yeah, because it's experience. And that's the tricky part because experience will tell you that it makes sense, that you're right, it doesn't matter to the condition. We're working with conditioning. Even if logically back then it was right, it's held in your body now, it's becoming your personality.
Mm,
Even so, you might be repressing in situations where it's not even about survival anymore. You're just repressing because it's who you are. It's your
mhm.
personality structure.
So can you give us some examples of different inquiry phrases that people might use?
Yeah, usually we do it by feeling into some area of the body where there might be holding it, like chronic pain or stomach contraction, heart contraction. And then we tend to bring people up because if you do it in midair, it's like expressed to who? It's not relevant, but there's mom, there's dad, there's wife, husband, boss, feeling into the area. We might say, I can, as a reverse inquiry, I can feel anger first. I can feel, or it's safe to feel anger. But then we get into, I can express the anger. So that right there will have mostly a lot of objections to it. So that's the thing that takes people out sometimes, is that they feel like it's just endless. It's going to be forever. It's not a story. It's reality. But there is an end to everything. Everything is finite. So if you stay in it, it does fall away, but they'll stop because of that. So it's not so much that we have this wonderful, I mean, we have good forms of inquiry. It's more the context around it, the understanding that it's a persistent story. So looking at it for a while is not going to get to that persistent story, but looking at it regularly will. So that's one of the blocks that people bring up, or the people that happens for people, is they'll
Mhm.
just dabble in it a little bit.
Mhm. And to make it kind of personal. So I can express anger to this person, or I can feel anger and then bring that person into the inquiry. Is
Yes.
that what you're suggesting in part?
With this work, more specific is better, because if you say generally I can express anger, it's like, to whom? You're not, it's not being, there's no challenge there. It's like, what? Who? But mom, no, that's different. I can feel and express anger to mom. There's specific reasons why that show up there. So yeah, we do it with people in relationship as we're looking at them.
Right.
We also go through all the other repressions though. Am I repressing fear, joy, sadness, guilt, shame, love, and affection, as you mentioned, because where there's one, there may be evidence of repression of the others. So take them through the full gamut of that.
So as a reverse inquiry, you might say, I can feel joy. It's safe for me to feel fear. Those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's so simple and obvious, but we probably just have never said things, like we've never inquired in that way. So there's nothing
Mhm.
magical about the phrase, but it's just the way that it's phrased tends to provoke up thought that says no. So let me say one more thing for people listening. If you have been in practice where there's a great degree of clarity happening for you, or awakening, or you feel, but there's some aspect of your body that's persistent, contraction or chronic pain, that's, there's a sign right there. So when you start, when you say, I can feel and express anger, it wouldn't be reasonable necessarily to assume that anger is just going to come up then, right then. What you might feel is the contraction, tightening, or because it's all repressed. So you have to stay with the thoughts, as I tell people. There's a habit of like, okay, well, let me come down and rest with a contraction, but it's not going to show you much because it's repressed. So I coach people to stay in the thoughts, because the mind has decided already a long time ago that you're not going to feel that. So when you come down to feel the anger, it's not going to be there, as long as your mind still has decided or keeps it going that you're not. Mind body connection right there.
Mhm.
Just seeing that, understanding the body's not acting on its own. It's not repressing fear down there for its own, for unknown reasons. There's a story here, and those are connected. So lately I've been saying, look, yeah, you can come and rest with a tightness or a chronic pain for sure. That's very nice, actually. It brings acceptance to it, maybe even some reduction in pain, but go into inquiry around the thoughts that won't let it do anything other than show up as a contraction. Stay
Mhm.
there for a while until some anger actually comes up, and then be with that, inquire into
Um,
that, or be with that when it comes up.
right. Right.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
Um, Other than just the work is always developing, as you know. So now people are coming out of repression and they're losing their pain or their contractions, but now they're dealing with the fact that here's this emotion online. And it's like, what do we do with that? So we're helping people who've never really been able to feel that or express it, unpack it again to get to the more vulnerable emotions.
Mhm.
So that's the other part that's developing now. The only other thing I want to mention, Lynn, is again, if anything in this interview resonates with anyone, I've stopped doing the experiential work publicly, because we want some degree of support for people during this process, because you can open something up and you don't have the skill to work with it. So we are moving to a new forum. I don't have the website yet, but if you go to kiloby.com and join my newsletter, you're going to see the announcement about that. So that forum we're going to be talking about these subjects. We're going to be helping people with repression, with everything that we work on, spiritual seeking, everything is going to be there. And we'll have videos, interactive videos, live meetings. And one thing we're working on is a facilitation session from me but I'm never there. So I'm just on video, pre-recorded. And so,
Mm.
like, if something comes up for you, and it's like, okay, I'm seeing words in my experience. You click something on the screen that says words, and then I come on and help
Oh,
you with that. And then if an emotion comes on, you click that, and then so it's pretty interactive, even though it's
yeah,
pre-recorded. And
that
that's the
sounds
kind of
pretty good.
thing, yeah, that makes me feel better about bringing this work to the world because just unloading these tools out in public without some conscientiousness around what can happen for people, this new form helps that so that we can, keep the support going and monitor and help people along the way. So stay tuned and join us if that sounds interesting.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and you have a lot of presence in social media, a lot of Facebook and YouTube lives and all kinds of different things that they can watch of yours as well, which is very helpful. And your
Right.
books, and we'll mention some of those. But the portal for everything is kiloby.com.
Kiloby.com, but we're going to create a new site that'll probably be embedded into that. That new site
Mm,
is going to have all the interaction with us, the
great.
work.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's always
Thank you.
exciting to hear what you're doing and
Yeah,
the depths to which you're taking this. And it's all based on your own personal experience, which
mhm.
is gives it a groundedness that some of these things don't have. But I always experience that with you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. We have an exciting lineup for our fifth annual, including Dr. Gabor Maté as our keynote speaker. Head on over to radicalrecoverysummit.com to learn more and watch the interviews.